Well, I'm Ken Newcombe. I'm the CEO and founder of Sequest Capital. And my business is to improve the lives of the rural poor through the marketplace in the developing countries.
Sounds great. So we're just going to go through kind of a series of questions, some of them a bit more about you, some of them a bit more about your industry, some of them a bit more about Sequest Capital.
Sure.
So the first one is, where are you from?
I was born in Australia, but I've been here a long time. So I'm a dual citizen.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so in Australia, were you like a city kid? Were you from?
No, I'm from the bush, basically. I mean, a lot of people will tell you that they're from the bush in Australia. The bush is very varied. So I'm from the kind of wet bush down in the Fertile Crescent, which is, out of Melbourne. And I grew up on a small dairy farm, milking cows by hand with my dad. And I basically grew up on that farm until I left to go to college.
And do you think that rural background had an impact on what it is you've ultimately ended up doing?
Yeah, in many ways. The most important thing was really just hard work, really. Getting used to the work ethic, having to get up early every morning to get the cows in and, milk them, separate the cream, get it off to the butter factory and ride to work, come back, school, I should say, and do the same thing in the evening. And so I think that was a discipline that helped me all the way through. But I still have roots to the land, and even today I'm thinking very hard about investing back in the land in Australia for the next phase of addressing climate change globally.
And so you think that kind of like interaction with farming, with the bush as a kid, that was what led you towards studying environmental health and natural resources?
That was kind of an accident, actually. I went to university to do agricultural science because I didn't know any better. I was a simple farm boy, and what else do little farm boys think about? But maybe we know something about farming, so why don't study agriculture? But pretty soon I realized this was physics and math and chemistry, and not much that I had that learned all my life was going to contribute to my degree until much later on, and I got bored. So I started to vary what I did, just because I had wide intellectual interests and nobody telling me, oh, you have to be an engineer or a lawyer, because my parents all left school at 12 years old and my sisters at 14. There was no tradition of higher education, so I was just out there.
Yeah, so you mentioned in there a bit of an interest in the more intellectual side of it, and while it definitely seems like you've always kept a connection with the physical, like real aid work and real stuff happening, physical infrastructure on the ground, definitely, you yourself have transitioned more into a role of, a guy in a suit that's getting to direct all these things. Can you talk a little bit about what that transition has been like?
Yeah, well, actually, day to day I never wear a suit, but anyway.
You only wear it for the interviews.
Yeah, but I used to. Yeah, that was important when I first joined the World Bank. Even in Papua New Guinea, when I was running the energy administration and the power company, I wouldn't wear a suit. But yeah, coming to Washington in the 80s, that was a totally different experience for me. But yeah, I was, I guess, more than anything else, impressed by the opportunity of markets to bring about change. And because for much of my life I'd been in a public institution, a multilateral development bank, and of course working for the government of Papua New Guinea, my view was how to capture entrepreneurial vigor and the power of the marketplace through public-private partnerships to bring about ways of effectively addressing global public goods. Because so much of my life has been about recognizing that there are externalities of environmental damage and change in so many ways, health impacts as well, that are not captured in market prices and that need a thoughtful government or thoughtful international agreements which motivate the private sector through well-formulated policy. So I've always been at that interface and always fascinated by how to harness the power of the private sector without having too much of an overweening role of government. So letting us free as the private sector to do what we can do best, but making sure that there's adequate guidance and policy protection to address those global environmental challenges, which are obviously a period of our age.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about the private sector thing. Obviously, looking at your website, one of Sequest Capital's big initiatives is carbon offsets and consumers or investors being able to purchase carbon offsets. Can you talk a little bit about what those are, how they work, and why I might buy a carbon offset?
Yeah, well, 20 years ago, that was a bit esoteric, because as a carbon offset, you can't smell it, feel it, touch it. It's an entirely conceptual product, just like the market itself, So you had to imagine it and figure out how you could define it contractually, what it meant physically, what was different that could generate an emission, a unit of greenhouse gas emissions reductions compared to the baseline. So, how would you say something is different, and what would be its value? So I was fortunate enough to be on the ground floor of building that market globally, the north-south or industrialized country, developing country trade in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And that's my business fundamentally today. So I started that in the World Bank and tried to demonstrate in as many countries as possible and with as many kinds of projects as possible, energy projects, renewable energy projects, avoided landfill gas, sequestration of carbon in soils, in forests, to take carbon out of the atmosphere, how you measure that, and turn it into a product which is a verified emission reduction, which can be purchased by companies who have obligations under national policy frameworks to reduce their carbon pollution, or companies that have some corporate social responsibility sense that they should be addressing climate change for their shareholders or for their consumers. And fundamentally, that's the business that I'm in today, although it's really the financial driver. When you look at what I do on the ground, it's very material things like efficient cook stoves or efficient lighting or renewable energy of one kind or another.
Yeah, the efficient cook stoves, I have to say, I was particularly impressed with. I've spent some time in Malawi myself, and
really?
yeah,
That's amazing.
And just the amount of deforestation that's going on for charcoal and for cooking fires is really quite incredible. So just that, really remarkable for me. Were there any particular aid projects that your organization has done that you're like one that stands above the others as the most impressive?
No, we don't do aid projects. We do business in trying to improve the lot of the rural poor. And the cook stove dimension of that is multifaceted. While absolutely we draw finance into clean cooking and clean air, clean kitchen air, through carbon finance or through getting capital to supply greenhouse gas emissions reductions to companies and governments, what is really significant to me is that the act of switching from a 3-stone open fire, which is incredibly smoky, to a cook stove, simple, robust, but one which cooks faster, uses finger-sized twigs rather than big logs that are chopped from trees or carried over long distances. That is a transformation in the lives of women and girls in particular, women, girls, and infant children. Because you would know from your time in Malawi that because forests are, less and less evident, and there are just trees scattered across the landscape, if you want to feed an open fire, you have to go and collect wood at some distance from the household. And on average, this could be 2 or 3 hours a day, not every day, but cumulatively. And girls have the same responsibility as women for chopping and gathering and carrying that wood into their kitchens. And when they're there, the smoke is now the single biggest killer of women and kids in the world. It's bigger than tuberculosis and HIV, AIDS, and malaria combined. And so if you can make combustion much more efficient through the kind of stove that you provide and reduce the smoke, you're having a double impact on health. You're not having women carry a heavy burden over long distances, which causes spinal damage and soft tissue damage, and the risks of being abused when they're outside their village boundary. And when they're in the kitchen, they're not inhaling the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes a day just by virtue of cooking for their family.
Really liked that quote at the beginning, we're not in the business of doing aid work, we're in the business of business. Can you talk a little bit more about why it is that private capital is just so much more effective at these things than governments and NGOs and stuff like
Well,
that?
it's part of what drives me to do the business that I'm in. And in fact, I've had a very difficult time since the global financial recession and the collapse of the global carbon markets made it very difficult for business continuity during the last 10 years. But my vision in keeping Sequest Capital alive is that I can demonstrate the significance, in fact, the critical importance of having the private sector involved in the riskiest business environments dealing with the problems of the poorest people in the world. I don't think that governments alone have any chance of addressing those problems. Governments in developing countries tend to be urban-centred, having very weak links into the rural areas, and particularly in the more remote rural areas. They're pretty much left to themselves. And NGOs are kind of episodic creatures. They get money from somebody today, it lasts for a year or 2 years, maybe even 5 years, and then they have to keep writing proposals to get money from somebody else. And there's this nexus between the development finance institutions, the bilateral donors of countries who want to support development, and the NGOs, but it's not the basis for a robust long-term entrepreneurial means of addressing problems that are pressing in nature. So I think the private sector can provide continuity. They can certainly bring technology to bear, and because of the profit motivation, they are constantly focused on delivering the product and making it better. I'm not saying the private sector alone, but I think the private sector is an absolutely essential ingredient in addressing the prosperity and improvement of the lives of the poor in developing countries. So that's what I would like to demonstrate, and I hope that we can get it done.
So shifting topics a little bit, in your opinion, what have been some of the greatest shifts in the public's environmental consciousness in the past decade, 2 decades, or since you've begun working? How has that impacted?
Well, clearly awareness about the significance of climate change, not in all of its dimensions, but that's been quite dramatic. I don't think they see it, the public, in an intellectual sense, that this is a sort of global externality, the result of industrialization and something which needs a critical means of internalizing it in market prices. That's a sort of academic, more economic perspective. But in terms of understanding that things are changing dramatically, it's climate change, not necessarily global warming, that is increasingly evident to people, that they're more at risk from severe weather events than ever before. And those who have their eyes open, think more broadly than the specific event. They think about the series of events, they think about risks, and they look at their insurance policies, because the smartest people in the world with respect to climate change are the insurance companies who have to address the damage function. And so the insurance company is saying, well, if you want to insure your house against this kind of weather event, you have to pay now twice or 3 times. And all of this is sort of feeding back on itself to create an awareness which just wasn't there 20 years ago when we began to talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, markets and trade. And I find that really helpful and reinforcing. Of course, capital is still a long way behind public opinion, especially if governments reject the notion that climate change is here and it's real. That's a handicap. But we're probably sitting in the only country in the world that really currently thinks that climate change is not real. Most of the rest of the world believe it.
We were just talking about climate change there, and obviously that is quite possibly the most pressing challenge that humans have ever faced. But it's been said that the greatest opportunities come from the greatest challenges. It comes from rising to meet those challenges. Not to ask you to give away any trade secrets or anything here, but what are some of the opportunities that it does create?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a feature of human behavior and of markets that, given the right signals, there will be a response. The only issue that I have with that, with respect to climate change, is that there's a tremendous lead time effect. In ecology, we call it the sort of J curve and the kind of collapse syndrome. And that's the biggest risk. Yes, markets will respond, technology will change. There will be all sorts of tremendous opportunities arising from this. But if you've got a lead time of 30 years, you've kind of bought the farm before you know that it's game over. And so, to my mind, while we must continue to try and find ways of getting carbon out of the atmosphere that's already been put there since the Industrial Revolution, the most significant challenge we have today is adaptation to climate change, because the poorest people in the world don't have the resources to create a resilient environment that is robust in the face of climate change. And most of them didn't have anything to do with the origin of it in the first case. But if you talk about opportunity, what excites me is the opportunity to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in soils through agriculture, which you might label as organic agriculture on the one hand, but it's just good land management. And there are really exciting ways in which you can improve grazing regimes all the way through to effectively crop management, with cover crops and lowering the amount of physical disruption to the soil, which makes the carbon in the soil more volatile and goes to atmosphere. The opportunity is dramatic, and it's only in the last few months that the first soil carbon emissions reductions have been sold in the world markets, actually only in Australia. So one of my ambitions is to bring the Australian practice and methodologies into the global market and try them in the US. But more and more people in this part of the world, the US, Canada, and Australia, and I think more broadly, recognize that there is a tremendous win-win, because every ton of organic carbon that's stored in the soil increases the fertility of the soil, increases its productivity, and creates this positive feedback situation. So if carbon finance, in the name of taking carbon out of the atmosphere to store it long-term in soils, is the driver of the finance for what in turn seems to be more resilient agriculture, more higher yielding, longer term, less need for chemicalization, then that's an incredible win-win. Just to give you an illustration, a 1% increase in soil organic carbon per hectare on grazing land means that there's 170,000 litres of additional water stored in the soil. And that alone increases resilience to variability in rainfall and in climate. But once you trigger that process and you've got the right microbial balance and you've got organic matter building up in the soil, farmers will never go back because their yield is higher, their resistance to the variability of climate is higher. And it's this positive feedback that I'd love to see happening at scale.
Yeah, and you're also talking about the rural livelihood starting to make sense again economically. And that's would be a real moderating effect on a lot of the politics we're seeing now.
Yeah, it would be. But one proviso in there is that it's not just the end of the agricultural drug companies with massive chemicalization of agriculture and tailor-making seeds and products to their chemicals, pesticides, and so on. We've got to see a rejuvenation of a biological approach to farming, which is fully consistent with increasing soil organic carbon and people better understanding really what's going on where they can't see it day to day, which is under the soil down even a metre, 2 metres. That movement called regenerative farming is really taking off around the world. And I think we can stimulate that with the mission of addressing climate change by finding ways to use carbon finance to finance farmers into new ways of doing things, which are in their own interest, but they have to get started somewhere, and the banks won't lend for something that appears exotic right now.
So I guess kind of to wrap it all up, and I think I have the answer to this, but is the future bright for Sequest Capital?
Yeah, finally. It's been, we've been living on fumes for 7 or 8 years, you know, a series of unfortunate events, you might say. And, you know, I've been always challenged within my family, you know, why is an old guy like you, you know, you've had success in your life, you've got a few resources, why don't you hang on to them and not put them at risk? I could never do that. It's not been my life, and I've managed to avoid bankruptcy by investing and just tightening up the business. And now, you know, they say the early bird gets the worm. Well, it's also the case that the last man standing is the first man in the next, you know, next round. So we find ourselves fortuitously in that situation. Everybody else went away. There was no operational platforms to do the sorts of things that you understand we do. And so when people came looking, we were equipped. It's been very hard, but yes, the future is bright, and you know, it's not for me so much about resources, though I'd like to get my money back. It's about having an impact at scale, and I think we're on the cusp of being able to do that.